Frederick Douglass was a self-educated slave who became one of America's greatest orators and abolitionists, a man who rose from bondage to become the conscience of a nation. Frederick Douglass, the most photographed American of the 19th century, was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland in February 1818. The exact date of his birth remains uncertain, as was common for enslaved people, though he later chose to celebrate it on February 14th. He was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a name he would later change when he escaped to freedom. His mother was Harriet Bailey, an enslaved woman, and his father was widely rumored to be a white man, possibly his owner. Frederick was separated from his mother when he was an infant, a cruel but common practice designed to break familial bonds among the enslaved. He saw his mother only a handful of times before her death when he was 7 years old, visits she made by walking 12 miles at night after working all day in the fields. Young Frederick was raised by his grandmother Betsy Bailey on a plantation owned by Aaron Anthony. At the age of 6, he was taken from his grandmother and sent to live on the Y House plantation, the home of his master. The separation was traumatic, marking the beginning of his conscious awareness of the brutality of slavery. In 1826, when Frederick was 8 years old, he was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia. This move would prove to be a turning point in his life. Sophia Auld, not yet hardened by the corrupting influence of slaveholding, began teaching young Frederick the alphabet. When Hugh Auld discovered this, he forbade his wife from continuing the lessons, declaring that education would make the boy unfit for slavery. But those words had the opposite effect on Frederick. He realized that literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom, and he became determined to educate himself. Frederick continued his education in secret, trading bread with poor white children in exchange for reading lessons. He studied discarded newspapers, copied letters from lumber at the shipyard, and read every book he could find. At 12 years old, he purchased a copy of the Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches about liberty, democracy, and courage. The book awakened in him a burning desire for freedom and gave him the language to articulate the injustice of slavery. In 1833, Frederick was sent back to the Eastern Shore to work for Thomas Auld, who found the teenager difficult to control. Auld sent him to work for Edward Covey, a farmer known as a slave breaker who had a reputation for crushing the spirits of rebellious slaves. For 6 months, Covey worked Frederick mercilessly and whipped him regularly. But one day in August 1834, Frederick fought back. When Covey attempted to tie him up for another beating, the 16-year-old Frederick resisted, and the two men fought for nearly 2 hours. Covey never touched him again. This physical resistance was a spiritual resurrection for Frederick. He later wrote that the fight rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom within him, and revived a sense of his own manhood. He was still enslaved, but he was no longer a slave in spirit. Frederick was then sent to work for William Freeland, a comparatively more lenient master, but Frederick's desire for freedom only grew stronger. He began conducting a secret school for fellow slaves, teaching them to read the New Testament on Sundays. In 1836, he planned an escape with several other enslaved men, but they were betrayed before they could flee. Frederick was jailed and feared he would be sold to plantations in the Deep South, a fate considered worse than death. Instead, he was sent back to Baltimore to learn the trade of ship caulking. In Baltimore, Frederick worked in the shipyards and was allowed to hire out his time, though he had to give his wages to Hugh Auld. During this period, he met Anna Murray, a free black woman who worked as a domestic servant. Anna was literate, independent, and became Frederick's partner in planning his escape. On September 3, 1838, disguised as a sailor and carrying papers borrowed from a free black seaman, 20-year-old Frederick Bailey boarded a train heading north. The journey was terrifying, with several close calls when conductors and passengers scrutinized his papers. But within 24 hours, he arrived in New York City, a free man. He had escaped slavery, but he was not yet safe. Slave catchers prowled northern cities, and the Fugitive Slave Act meant he could be captured and returned to bondage at any time. Anna Murray joined him in New York, and they were married on September 15, 1838. To avoid capture, they moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Frederick took a new surname, Douglass, inspired by a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem The Lady of the Lake. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey had become Frederick Douglass. In New Bedford, Douglass worked as a laborer while becoming active in the abolitionist movement. He attended meetings of the Anti-Slavery Society and subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. In August 1841, Douglass was invited to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. He was reluctant and nervous, but when he took the stage and told his story, the audience was electrified. His powerful voice, commanding presence, and eloquent testimony about the horrors of slavery made an immediate impact. William Lloyd Garrison, the leading white abolitionist, spoke after Douglass and asked the crowd, "Shall such a man be held a slave in a Christian land?" The crowd roared back, "Never." The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society immediately hired Douglass as a lecturer. For the next several years, he traveled throughout the North, speaking to audiences about his experiences in slavery and advocating for abolition. But some people doubted his story. How could someone so articulate and refined have been a slave? To silence the skeptics, Douglass decided to write his autobiography. In 1845, Douglass published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The book was a sensation, selling thousands of copies and being translated into several languages. It was a searing indictment of slavery, written with literary skill and moral clarity. Douglass named his former owners and described specific events, which proved his authenticity but also put him in grave danger. As a fugitive slave, publishing his story with such detail meant he could be captured and returned to Maryland. Friends urged him to leave the country, and in August 1845, Douglass sailed to Ireland and Britain. He spent nearly 2 years touring Ireland, Scotland, and England, speaking to enthusiastic audiences and raising money for the abolitionist cause. The British treated him as an equal, a stark contrast to the discrimination he faced in America. He later wrote that he could ride on any railway, sit in any seat, eat at any table, and sleep in any bed without insult. British supporters raised funds to purchase his freedom, and in December 1846, Hugh Auld signed manumission papers. Frederick Douglass was legally free. Douglass returned to America in 1847 with enough money to start his own abolitionist newspaper. He moved his family to Rochester, New York, and began publishing the North Star, named after the celestial guide that escaping slaves followed to freedom. The newspaper's motto was "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren," reflecting Douglass's commitment not only to abolition but also to women's rights and universal human equality. Douglass was one of the few men to attend the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's rights convention in America, and he spoke eloquently in support of women's suffrage. Publishing the North Star put Douglass at odds with William Lloyd Garrison, who believed moral persuasion alone would end slavery. Douglass had come to believe that political action was necessary, and he supported the Liberty Party and later the Republican Party. The split with Garrison was bitter, but Douglass was charting his own course. Douglass's home in Rochester became a station on the Underground Railroad. He and Anna sheltered hundreds of escaped slaves, providing them with food, clothing, and money as they made their way to Canada. Douglass worked closely with Harriet Tubman, whom he deeply admired for her courage in repeatedly returning to the South to lead others to freedom. He also befriended John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed armed insurrection was the only way to end slavery. In 1859, Brown asked Douglass to join him in his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Douglass refused, believing the plan was suicidal and would harm the abolitionist cause. When Brown's raid failed and he was executed, Douglass fled to Canada and then to England, fearing he would be arrested as a co-conspirator. Letters between Douglass and Brown had been discovered, and Douglass's name was mentioned in the investigation. He returned to America in 1860 after the controversy died down and just months before his daughter Annie died at the age of 10, a devastating personal loss. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 transformed the political landscape. Initially, Lincoln insisted the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. Douglass was frustrated and used his newspaper and speeches to pressure Lincoln to make emancipation a war aim and to allow black men to fight for their freedom. Douglass argued that the war would never be won without striking at the heart of the rebellion, which was slavery itself. He declared that the Negro is the key to the situation, the pivot upon which the whole rebellion turns. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate territory were free. Douglas praised the proclamation but knew it was only a first step. He also criticized Lincoln for not granting equal pay and treatment to black soldiers who were finally allowed to enlist in the Union Army. Douglas became a recruiting agent for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black units in the Union Army. Two of his sons, Charles and Louis, enlisted. Douglas traveled throughout the North, urging black men to join the fight, telling them that once you let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. But when black soldiers were paid less than white soldiers and faced harsher punishments, Douglas stopped recruiting and demanded a meeting with President Lincoln. In August 1863, Douglas met Lincoln at the White House. It was a historic meeting, the first time a black leader had been received by a president as an equal. Lincoln listened to Douglas's concerns and promised that black soldiers would eventually receive equal pay, though he defended the initial inequality as a necessary compromise to get white soldiers to accept black troops. Douglas left the meeting impressed by Lincoln's honesty and believing the president was genuinely committed to freedom, even if progress was slower than Douglas wanted. Douglas met with Lincoln again in 1864, when the president asked for his help in devising a plan to encourage more slaves to escape to Union lines before the war ended. Lincoln feared he might not win re-election and that a new administration might negotiate peace without ending slavery. Douglas developed a plan, but it became unnecessary when Lincoln won re-election and the war turned decisively in favor of the Union. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. Douglas mourned Lincoln deeply, calling him emphatically the black man's president, the first to show any respect for their rights as men. With slavery abolished by the 13th Amendment, Douglas turned his attention to ensuring that formerly enslaved people would have full citizenship rights. He advocated for the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. But Douglas knew that legal rights meant little without economic opportunity and education, and he continued to speak out against the injustices faced by black Americans during Reconstruction. In 1872, Douglas moved to Washington, D.C., which would remain his home for the rest of his life. He purchased a grand estate called Cedar Hill in Anacostia, becoming the first black man to own property in that neighborhood. Some neighbors objected, but Douglas refused to be intimidated. He continued to write, speak, and advocate for civil rights, women's suffrage, and social justice. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes appointed Douglas as United States Marshal for the District of Columbia, making him the first African American to hold such a high federal position. He later served as Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C., and in 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed him as Minister to Haiti, representing American interests in the Black Republic. Douglas's personal life also underwent significant change. Anna Murray Douglas, his wife of 44 years, died in 1882. She had been a partner in his escape from slavery and had supported his work throughout their marriage, though she remained largely in the background, never learning to read or write fluently. In 1884, Douglas married Helen Pitts, a white feminist and former secretary who was nearly 20 years his junior. The interracial marriage caused a scandal and drew criticism from both black and white communities. Douglas responded that his first wife was the color of my mother and the second the color of my father, dismissing the controversy with characteristic wit and principle. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, Douglas remained active, speaking against lynching, Jim Crow laws, and the erosion of civil rights gains made during Reconstruction. He was deeply disappointed by the failure of America to live up to its promises to formerly enslaved people. The Reconstruction era had ended, and the South was systematically disenfranchising black voters and instituting segregation. Douglas watched with anger and sorrow as the nation abandoned its commitment to racial equality. Yet he never stopped believing in the possibility of American democracy and never stopped demanding that America live up to its founding ideals. he continued to revise and expand his autobiography, publishing My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855 and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881, with a final revision in 1892. These works documented not only his personal journey but the larger story of America's struggle with slavery and freedom. Douglass was also a pioneering figure in the use of photography. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century, sitting for more portraits than even Abraham Lincoln. Douglass understood the power of images and carefully controlled how he was represented, always appearing dignified, serious, and refined. He believed that photographs could counter racist caricatures and show the world that black people were fully human and deserving of respect. On February 20, 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., where he received a standing ovation. He returned home to Cedar Hill that evening and was telling Helen about the meeting when he suddenly collapsed. Frederick Douglass died of a heart attack at the age of 77. His death was mourned across the nation and around the world. Thousands attended his funeral in Washington, and memorial services were held in cities throughout America and in Europe. Tributes poured in from leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens whose lives he had touched. Douglass had lived long enough to see slavery abolished, but not long enough to see the full promise of freedom realized for African Americans. The struggles he fought would continue for generations. Yet his legacy was secure. Frederick Douglass had transformed himself from a piece of property into one of the most influential Americans of his century. He had used the power of words and the force of his moral conviction to challenge a nation to live up to its ideals. He had been a slave, an abolitionist, an orator, a writer, a newspaper editor, a diplomat, and above all, a champion of human dignity and freedom. Douglass's life was a testament to the power of education, the strength of the human spirit, and the possibility of change. He proved that one person, armed with courage and truth, could make a difference. His writings remain essential texts in American literature and history, his speeches still inspire those who fight for justice, and his example continues to challenge us to confront the contradictions between our ideals and our actions. Frederick Douglass was born a slave but died a statesman. He was denied his freedom but claimed it for himself and then spent his life helping others claim theirs. He was told he was property but proved he was a person of extraordinary gifts and unshakable principles. He faced a nation that denied his humanity and forced it to recognize not only his humanity but the humanity of all enslaved and oppressed people. In death, as in life, Frederick Douglass remained a towering figure in American history, a voice for the voiceless, and a reminder that the arc of history bends toward justice only when people like him refuse to accept injustice.